Hey guys, how's it going? TheHaggardNerd here. Welcome back to another video on the cider making series. We have finished with our primary fermentation. We're getting some very few bubbles here, so this is towards the end of the primary fermentation. So the idea is what we want to do is we want to get it off the lees, the stuff that settles out during fermentation, so that way you don't get any of the off flavors that can produce. Some people like to leave it on a little bit longer to get a little bit of a complexity in their cider. But you kind of have to know what you're doing in order to do that. I personally don't like to do that. I like to have like a very, very clean flavored cider. So today, even though we're still getting just a few bubbles up top here, I'm going to go ahead and rack into our secondary container, and I will show you guys how to do that today. All right, so this is everything we're going to be using today. Obviously, our original cider that we are brewing in our original fermentation container. So the second thing we're going to need is a secondary vessel of the same size generally. I mean, you want one smaller, obviously. You can go in large if you want, but then you risk having a lot of oxygen in the top of your vessel there, like basically your head space. So you can get a lot of oxygen here. And I realize that oxygen is bad for alcohol. Oxygen messes with the alcohol flavor, which it does oxidize the alcohol. That's what I was trying to explain in my last video, but completely forgot what I was saying, so I derped that up. But oxygen is great for yeast when it's fermenting, bad for alcohol after it's done fermenting. So to clarify that, that's what that is. So yeah, you need your secondary container, which is great. I'm also going to be using PBW, which is a great brewer's cleaner. It helps to like really break down organic solids and stuff to get your equipment clean and everything. I mentioned Starsan before, so we're going to wash it twice, once with PBW, once again. We're going to wash this and our other equipment once in PBW and then again in Starsan. And then as needed, we'll squirt some sanitizer just for anything that's going to be coming into contact with our cider. So basically when I dip my tubing and everything down into our original cider, we'll give it a squirt of sanitizer just to kind of, you know, make sure we're good there. So what you will also need is some sort of airlock, one of these guys. So, you know, I would normally use a bunch of mine, but lately, I've come across these silicone stoppers, and they have holes in the bottom, and they have this cap on top, and those holes go all the way through, as you can see there. And there's 5 of them. So what happens here? This actually acts as an airlock. So instead of using water and you know, all that, the gas can push up and through there and come out, you know, push through the bottom of the lid, but the air can't get back in because it basically produces like suction, not really suction, but it's a one-way trip here basically. So it acts as an airlock, but without water, which I kind of like this, so that way you don't have to worry about filling up your airlocks every so often and doing kind of like what I do by accident and forget, and then your airlocks go dry. Also, what I'm going to be using is autosiphons are great if you have one. If you don't have one, you can just use usual tubing for your siphons. If you guys know how siphons work, you can just use a tube like I have here. But I generally prefer autosiphons because they make life infinitely easier. I have some clamps here to hold the siphon and tubing in place, and then I have like a little plastic cutoff thing for the tube, which is very, very handy if you're needing to cut the flow off really, really fast. So the first step in this process is we're going to flip around here. I'm going to go ahead and wash things. I have a carboy cleaner, you know, a vessel cleaner. Basically, this thing is very, very handy. You don't have to do this. You can just put water in your vessel and shake it around really, really hard, and that'll do the job. But I like to leave this going for about 10 or 15 minutes per wash. So the first step is to put our PBW in. This stuff, put our PBW in, put our vessel on top, run that for about 15 minutes, and then do the same thing, rinse and repeat with the Starsan. And I'll show you guys that process. Obviously, you're not going to be watching for the entire 15 minutes, but I'll show you the quick initial setups of both of those processes. All right, so I have my secondary container here in the sink, and I have my carboy washer here. I've got the small extension on, so it doesn't have the super long extension that it usually comes with, so that way it can fit our little 1 gallon glass container. All this is a water pump that I've set down in here, and I'm about to add some PBW to this warm water that I use, and then this just sits on top. Nothing too fancy, but it is very, very handy. I'll go ahead and clip that in and add the PBW and get it started. I'm sure there's a specific amount of PBW that you're supposed to be using, but I just kind of eyeball it. Maybe about couple tablespoons worth. Ooh, unless there's chunks that you don't realize is in there. I'm just gonna go ahead and mix that in. Then I'm just going to sit our glass container on top of the spout. And that looks like that might work. It might be actually a little too small. Let's try that. So I've got this connected into a Shockbuster is what it's called. It's basically a GFCI. And actually this is a GFCI as well, so I'm doubly protected. But I like to use this because this has no on-off switch. So it basically gives me an on-off switch that I can use. Yeah, that's not big enough. Let's try again. Okay, so a lot of this is trial and error. A lot of what I've done is trial and error. So let's see if the larger one works. I think it does. Oh, just barely. I have just barely enough clearance, but that should be enough. Oh man, I don't know if that's gonna work. I don't like that. So, I may just have to do this by hand. Unless I can lean it backwards like this. I think I'm gonna do that. There we go. That way we get full coverage on the inside. Now, as long as that stays there, we'll be fine. But yeah, so I'm gonna let this run for about 15 minutes. I'm gonna come back and check on it every so often just to make sure that this little thing is in place. But basically what's happening here is the water's getting shot out to the top here, and then it's fully saturating, fully covering the inside, and then draining out the bottom. So I'm gonna let that wash for about 15 minutes, and then I'm gonna repeat this process with sanitizer. All right, guys, so it's been about 15 minutes, and the PBW has had time to get in there and break anything up and wash this pretty well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to rinse this, and then I'm gonna run it through sanitizer, and then we'll be good to rack. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. Okay, this thing held, thankfully, so excited for that. Yeah, it had purpose. So I'm gonna go ahead and just pull this off. And tap water isn't necessarily that sanitary. So if you can, you want to avoid direct tap water to cider contact at any point. But for the initial stage of cleaning, it's perfectly fine. Because this is just the washing phase, not the sanitary phase. So one thing I would recommend is when you're rinsing or washing with PBW, make sure you get as many or all of the bubbles out from PBW, because the PBW bubbles are different than sanitizer bubbles. Very important to note. All right, so nice clean container to rack in. So now what I'm gonna do is go ahead and change out our water here with sanitizer water and let that run for another 15 minutes. So for Starsan, what you're supposed to do is 1 ounce of Starsan to 5 gallons of tap water. This is obviously not 5 gallons, so I'm just gonna use a small amount. There's actually this little thing where there's a tube that as you squeeze it, it pushes the Starsan up into this little measuring cup, and you can actually see, I don't know, I'll bring it in close. You can see as I squeeze, it actually fills up, and that's actually way too much, so I'm not gonna use all of it. But I'm just gonna use maybe about a quarter of that, just to kind of get in there. There we go. And now we're gonna just do the same thing we did before. I'm gonna put this up on our washer, and I'm also going to add, oh, it came undone. I'm also going to add our holder, because that seemed to work. Everything's good. And now just a heads up, this is gonna bubble up pretty significantly, so I'm kind of gonna move it away from the edge here because it might get a little messy. So yeah, we're already starting to get some foaming. But here's a bit of a closer look at this thing, which is very handy. So yeah, it shoots up right there. You can see it covers the entire inside, which is very cool. And as I mentioned, I am plugged in to a GFCI, into a GFCI, so I'm protected. It's never a good idea to mix electricity and water. Just a heads up on that. This is a safety thing, but I'm doubly protected, and I'm being very, very careful with how I use this. And plus that is a water pump, so, you know, I feel a little bit more safe about that. So it's been about 20 minutes, and this is fun. So as I said, it was going to bubble up, and it did. But I kind of made a mistake. I forgot that when I was supposed to be sanitizing this, I was so focused on getting this sanitized, I forgot to sanitize my tubing and my my autosiphon and everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let this continue to run for another 20 minutes. More sanitization never hurts. So I'm going to go ahead and fill up a bucket with some sanitizer, put my tubing and my autosiphons in there, and let those sit as well, and then we'll be ready to rack. Okay, so it's been another 20 minutes, and this thing should be nice and sanitary. Also, everything in our solution here should be sanitary as well. So I think we're clean enough to go ahead and start getting started with our racking process. So let me go ahead and turn this off. All right. So you notice we got some bubbles in here. Let's bring it down. So we got some bubbles and stuff in here. Once again, this is not like soapy bubbles. They're not going to give you a bad time, if you know what I mean. But these bubbles are fine to leave in there. I mean, obviously empty it as much as you can. But like, that's not gonna hurt you. If I'm not mistaken, the sanitizer actually breaks down. And I forget exactly what the process is, but basically the sanitizer breaks down and it doesn't like hurt the yeast. The yeast actually ends up dying out anyway, and everything just kind of falls out. So it doesn't hurt you. Sanitizer suds, not a problem. So as I mentioned before, tap water is not perfectly sanitary. So instead of going in here and rinsing off and then potentially contaminating our vessel again, I'm just gonna leave it like this because it's safer for our yeast and for our cider at least. So I'm gonna set that off to the side for right now. I'm gonna leave this alone for right now because that's just a mess that I'll clean up later. All right, so now that everything's been sanitized, we can begin the actual racking process. And for those of you not familiar, racking is the act of getting your liquid out of one vessel and into another. Super simple. We use a siphon in order to do that, so that way we can move from one vessel to another without creating a lot of aeration, because you don't want to aerate your cider, because that would make your alcohol oxidize, and you don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to use this toolbox that I have down here. Just kind of handy like. I'm going to put my sanitized vessel down on it, because the bottom doesn't matter. It's the inside that matters as far as sanitation goes. And then what I'm going to do is trying to think of how I'm going to do this without touching anything. I think I'm just going to go ahead and build it in here. So what I have here, the way this works, is there's a main outside tube. There's a little cap that goes on the end that keeps solids from getting into your siphon. I mean, it only can do so much. You have your actual siphon plunger, and what that does is that goes inside there, and then as you pull up, it creates suction, and it draws liquid into the tube, and then when you push, it pushes it out the top there. It's super handy, so that way you don't have to go put in your mouth, and you know, there's bacteria in your mouth and stuff that will go on the tube. If we can prevent that, it's good. Sanitation is key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and connect this up to the hose. So just making sure I have the right side here. So all I'm going to do is just push that on the tip there. Ow. Gotta be careful. Okay, that fits on just perfectly. I'm not going to put it on too far, just far enough to hold it. And we can see here now when I pull up, there's now liquid in there. And then when I push it down, we now have siphoned sanitizer going through our tubes, which is fine. Once again, the bubbles don't hurt anything. Okay, so we're almost ready. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my holder on the outside there, so that way we can set it on the lip of our primary, just like this. And then I'm gonna use the other side to hold to the side of our vessel here, so that way we can control the output or the flow of the cider into our other vessel. So as I mentioned before, you want to try to aerate as little as possible. So you want to get your liquid from vessel 1 to vessel 2. Obviously you have to move the liquid, but you want to do it in like as calm as a manner as possible. So I could set this all the way on the floor, but that would create even more pressure on the siphon, if you know how that works. And that would stir it up more than we really need. So that's why I've only got it offset just a little bit here. You can do it either way if you want, but personally I prefer not having too much of a difference between the levels of my primary and my secondary. Sometimes you can't get away with it. I mean, if you gotta sit on the floor, you can, but just try to do your best to minimize the amount of agitation you put your cider through. So, I think we're pretty much good to go here. Big word of caution. I've I've broken so much glassware by doing this. When it comes to pulling a dry bung out of a vessel, a container, never like try to pry it, because you'll just immediately break the lip of whatever glass you're using, unless it's like really sturdy glass, but I would still not suggest prying it. So if you can, try to wiggle it out in kind of like a circular motion, because then it'll loosen it up and it'll become unstuck that way. Just any method other than trying to pry it is better than trying to pry it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to twist to get the airlock out. Sometimes if you have really old airlocks, and these are kind of aged, they might break on you, so you gotta be careful with that. So I'm also gonna do just a very, very gentle circular rocking motion. There we go. There we go, and they both came out without any sort of problem. So I'm just gonna go sit this over in the sink and I'll wash this up after we're done. Okay, so our cider is now exposed. You gotta be careful with that. One sniff, and that smells like a really good young cider. Young cider isn't like an amazing scent. It's a little weird, it's a little musty, but it's not like a bad musty. It's like, as it ages, it releases some of that kind of bad flavor and it mellows out and it becomes a much better scent. But I mean, it fermented well, we gave it nutrients, and it should be a good cider once it has some time to age, which is very important. If you let your cider age, it's kind of like wine. The longer you let it sit, the more mellow and smooth it becomes. And there's a thing that I need to read up on more called malolactic fermentation, which I think is something that occurs just over time. And as I'm talking, you may notice I'm getting out my hydrometer. Since we have opened up our vessel, now is a good time to go ahead and get a hydrometer reading to make sure that, in fact, we are 100% fermented. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put this down next to where I'm gonna be siphoning from. I'm gonna go ahead and place the, other way. I almost messed up there. Place our siphon down into the vessel, just like that. I've not got it in just yet, but I'm just getting everything positioned first, making sure there's no additional liquids in the line if I can help it. I mean, it's gonna be damp in there, but it's not gonna hurt anything. So I'm gonna take one more chance to empty out any additional sanitizer foam. I'm gonna set this down in the bottom as far as I can. I'm gonna try to put it in basically a circular motion, so that way it'll kind of, not really stir itself, but not splash. I just don't want it to splash, so that's the important thing. So let's go ahead and do it like that. That should work. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and start the siphon, and once it gets going, I'm going to clamp it, I'm gonna pull it out, get a reading, and then put it back in. And then that way we'll know everything's good. So let's go ahead and dip it down into, here, I'll bring you guys along for the ride for this. So for this, I'm just gonna push the tip of it down into the liquid just far enough. I'm doing my best, absolutely important, to not let the tip of your siphon or the tube you're using, either way, to get it down into the lees. We want to pull from as close to the top as possible without sucking in air. So I'm going to try to put it about midway. And then as we go, I'm going to very carefully tip the vessel, so that way we get, you know, more liquid at the bottom, and we do not pull up our lees into our secondary fermenter container, whatever. Okay, so you can't see it, but it's about this far down. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this up. Well, that didn't work. There we go. There we go. Okay, so it's only up to in this container as far as the top of the liquid, which makes sense, I guess. So we're going to go ahead and push it down, and you'll see the cider push up and through. And that was not enough, so let's do it again. There we go. All right, let's try this again. I may have messed up, but it's just a process. You just got to get it going. There we go. So now it's started. Now it's started. We have slow draining. It's going through there. flowing up and through there. As you can see, it's moving, and it's not splashing too much. It's a little bubbly, but it should be all right. I'm going to go ahead and clamp this off. All right, so now that I've got the siphon going, and it's a secure siphon, it's a locked siphon. I don't know what the technical term is. It's in action. I've currently got it closed off with my little clip here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this very carefully and just feed it over into my test tube. And I'm going to unclip this. It should keep coming. There we go, we got liquid going now. I'm just gonna let it fill up. Being careful not to touch the actual test tube with the tube, because then that'll introduce contaminants into our cider. All right, so it's floating now, which is good. So let's go ahead and put this back in here. And I made a little bit of a mess there, but it happens. And let's turn that again so it flows in a circular fashion. Go ahead and unclip that. And I'm going to go ahead and worry about racking first, and then we will take measurements after. All right, so I'm just going to use just a random bung. And go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and tip up. I'm going to push this down a little bit further. I'm going to tip up our cider. Very, very careful as not to agitate the lees. And also don't want to tip over your vessel. There we go. Now at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of do this by hand. Don't necessarily need this clip up here, messing with stuff. Very, very careful. This is really helpful when you have like 6-gallon carboys going. All right, so we're still, oh, I managed to lose my siphon again. Awesome, I wonder why that is. Because I'm a derp, that's why. Okay, so we're going again. And I'm just going to kind of keep a watch and make sure I don't get any of the lees. Now, it is unfortunate, even though we started with a gallon of pressed juice, we're not going to end up with a full gallon of cider, because there's no way to get every ounce of liquid out of the bottom of this. We are going to have a little bit of waste, unfortunately. It's one of my least favorite things about cider making. But you don't want to risk pulling any of that lees up and in here into our secondary. Okay, we're getting close. We're getting pretty good, actually. Those lees are holding together pretty good. You can see it kind of separating in the back there. Push down a little bit more. We're probably going to pick up a little bit of sediment. And it looks like we've pretty much lost our siphon again. So that, I think that's enough. I don't want to risk sucking more in. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this down and disconnect this. And yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to immediately disconnect from here, because I don't want to risk pulling anything else into our secondary. There we go. So now we have racked secondary. And I let a little bit of bubbles in there. I didn't realize that was going to be a thing. You can try to avoid that if you can, but sometimes you can't, unfortunately. So we're going to pull this out. I'm just going to go ahead and throw it over in the sink. And then we have our bung that has been sitting in our sanitizer for a while. So just for the sake of posterity, I'm going to go ahead and squirt it with a little bit of sanitizer just to make sure. Double sanitize. And I'm just going to go ahead and plop this down. This one's actually a little bit bigger than what this vessel is meant for. This is like a 7 size. This is probably like a 6.5 opening, but it's fine. And it's not sealing perfectly right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it sitting on top like this. And then later, once this dries a little bit, I'll try to get a little bit more pressure down on it. So yeah, this is our rack cider. So I'm going to put this to the side and we'll discuss this in just a moment. But right now we have all of our lees and stuff that we need to go dump out, and we'll need to wash this with PBW to make sure all this grime and stuff doesn't like dry and get stuck onto this vessel. So let's go ahead and put this over in the sink as well. All right, so we have our racked cider and we have our test tube with our hydrometer in it. I'm looking at the numbers right now. See if we can get you focused in here. And it's reading, it's hard to kind of see, a little bit above 1. We want it right at 1, but there's a thing to note here. Our cider is still very, very fizzy from fermentation, so you actually have bubbles attached to the hydrometer, which is causing our hydrometer to float a little bit. So I'm going to say that this is getting right down close to 1, but it's just being held up. It's being suspended by the fizz. So, you know, you can mix it around a little bit, try to help with that. Let it stop bobbing. There we go. So yeah, that's going to eventually make its way down all the way to 0. There's still a little bit of residual sugars in here. And that will ferment out over the course of the next couple months. I'm actually going to let this sit for about 2 months. And I want to talk to you guys about clarification. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So at this point in the cider making process, we have racked into our secondary. So at this point, we're going to let it sit for a while. And then what that's going to do is it's going to allow any of the additional solids to drop out. It's going to help clarify our cider and get it that nice bright amber color that we should expect from our cider. A few ways you can do this. Number one, the patient way. What you do is you just let it sit for a very, very long time, and eventually it will drop out. You may not get a perfectly clear cider that way, but it's a good way to do it. Some people like to use super clear, and it's a two-step process that basically just gloms onto any of the remaining solids in there and drops them out in like 24 hours. I generally don't use this. I've tried to use this a couple times, but I'm not a big fan of adding stuff to my cider, so I stopped using that. Oh, I dropped that. That's real good. Another option is sparkaloid powder, which is basically diatomaceous earth. It does the same thing, only it takes quite a bit longer. You mix it in hot water, and then the particles in the diatomaceous earth, sparkaloid, grab onto the solids and drop them out. And over time, it makes a nice another layer of leaves that you want to pull off and rack into a third vessel later on. But what I like to do is I like to just let it sit. And like I said, I'm going to let this sit for maybe another month or two. I'm going to come back and check it periodically just to see how it's doing. And then once it's ready, I'll rack it into a third vessel, maybe let it sit for a little bit longer, or I may go ahead and look into kegging this up and getting it ready to drink. So one last thing before we put this away for a while is I want to go ahead and test this. And I might be a bit of an uncultured swine here from drinking straight from a tube. Oh, that's going to be good. Even right now, it's good. Because it's got a bit of the carbonation from the fermentation. It's dry, but it's still got a lot of that residual like brightness on the nose. It's got a lot of malic acid. The sugars have definitely went away, but there's still a little bit of residual sugars from not fully fermenting all the way. But once we're finished with this, and once we get it flavored back up and back sweetened and everything, this is going to be actually a really good cider. One thing to note for young ciders, it will have a bit of a hot flavor. The alcohol is still going to be very, very warm in the mouth. After you swallow, you'll notice that there's just a residual heat. That's from the cider being new. The idea is the longer you let a cider sit, similar to wine, the more mellow the flavors will become and that heat will go away. If you messed up somewhere along the line, you get a little bit of sulfur flavor, a little bit of barnyard flavor. Letting it sit will also help. But the best cider you can make is if you do it good from start to scratch, properly, correctly, from start to scratch, start to end. So that way you don't have to worry about trying to correct those flavors later on. I'm actually really impressed with this flavor, and I'm going to go up and let the wife try it, and I think she's going to be happy too. So, I hope you enjoyed this process so far. Obviously, it's going to be a little while before I make another video, unless I start another batch, which is possible. But if you guys have any questions or comments or anything at all you want to discuss about this process, let me know. Let me know what you think of this series so far. If you'd like me to continue it, I definitely will if you want me to. And yeah, we'll check back in as needed for this batch and see how it goes. So I'm excited for that. So thank you guys for watching this series so far. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next video. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.